I've been teaching at the university level for a long time. Every year, frustrated students ask for advice on how to study. I've decided to make this video to put my thoughts over the years into a succinct and useful form. What I say in this video will work for students at the high school level, but it's better suited to college. This advice should be useful for most subjects, although I'm a scientist and I have the most experience with that. I hope you'll give some of this a shot. Some of this advice will be familiar to you, and some of it will be new. An important point to stress from the start is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to learning. Everyone is different. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. Some of my tips will work for some people, but not others. It's up to you to figure out how you learn best, and this can only be accomplished by trying out lots of things. Also, doing all of what I suggest would be overkill for most students. Doing everything would probably only make sense for those who want to be scholars. If you plan to do a PhD after college, for example, then you really should master your core subject material, and this will require a lot of work. If you just want better grades, however, then a few of these tips might be enough. Just take what you like. I'm going to start with some advice that will be important, not just for studying, but for many things in life. You've probably heard this before, but I would be remiss if I didn't say it again. Don't wait until right before the test to start studying. Start as soon as possible. In other words, don't study for 12 hours right before the exam. If the test is in 3 weeks, then study for 4 hours per week. You will learn more in the same amount of time, and it will be far less stressful. I know you might think you work best under pressure, but to be honest, you probably don't. You get the job done under pressure, but usually you would have done a better job if you broke up the work into lots of small blocks and did them according to a schedule. For example, if you are covering a chapter a week, then study each week's material that week. Do the reading, attend the lecture, and spend an hour or so studying as though the exam was that week. Yes, you will forget some of it before the exam in a few weeks, but you will cover the same stuff again during your final cram before the test. Humans learn via repetition and reinforcement. If you study a little each week, then when you do your study session right before the test, you will already have a significant fraction of the material in your mind. Ironically, I will be saying that humans learn via repetition and reinforcement repeatedly in this video. I hope it doesn't get annoying, but the importance of this cannot be overstated. Think about your favorite movie. I think I've seen my favorite movie dozens of times. I know half the dialogue by heart. It's probably the same for you. Why is that? Repetition and reinforcement. You kept watching the movie over and over until you knew it by heart. As you were watching, you were learning a huge amount of information, all that dialogue and all those scenes, without even trying, just by watching it over and over. Your brain is basically designed to think that things that you are exposed to repeatedly are more important than things you encounter just once. So the learning process in your brain really kicks into gear with each new exposure to the same information. Next, if there is reading assigned for a lecture, do the reading before class. Again, the more times you are exposed to the information, and especially if you are exposed in multiple ways, the more you are going to retain that information. If you do the reading before class, then you are already familiar with half the ideas before a lecture. This allows you to relax and take in the information at a more comfortable pace. Again, this is because you already know half of what the professor is saying, and you can then focus on the other half. Your note-taking and what you get from class will be much improved if you follow this simple advice. Here we come to a key point. Many students study by creating huge piles of flashcards and grilling themselves with them for hours. This is rote memorization. It's useful and it can work if you do it enough, but it's a pretty inefficient way to study. I personally never did this when I was a student. Instead, if there was a textbook for my class, then I would read that book multiple times. I tried to read each chapter 3 times before the exam. I made a schedule that included all the time in between the exams so that I could break up my reading into lots of small blocks. Which brings me to an important point about mindset. You might be wondering, where am I supposed to get the time for all this? If you're really serious about getting good grades in college, then it helps to think about school as your job. After all, you're an adult. You're not getting paid, but you're working in the hope that your degree will allow you to get a better job in the future. If you think about it this way, then working 6 to 8 hours a day is just a normal job. Within that time, you can make up a schedule that will allow you to do all the things you need to excel. By the way, you're probably already working a lot of hours per week if you average over all your studying. You just do little up to the week of the exam, and then a huge amount of work cramming. This is not as efficient as a schedule and steady work each day. My friends laughed at me, by the way, when I told them I read each chapter 3 times, but I pointed out that reading the chapter 3 times actually took me less time than they spent grilling flashcards. When you read something repeatedly, each successive reading is easier and faster. By my 3rd reading, I usually knew all the material and was ready for the exam. Some classes these days do not have textbooks. However, lectures are often video recorded and put onto the course website. This is now common at big universities. In this case, I would substitute reading the chapter 3 times with watching the lecture a few times. It's the same principle. Repeated exposure leads to good retention of the information. If you attend class, then that means 2 more viewings of the lecture. I give my students a study guide before each exam. Most professors do these days. Students might be stunned to learn that we never got study guides when I was in college 30 years ago. But of course, times change. If I was a student now, I'd read the study guide 10 times. I'm not exaggerating. Maybe twice a day for 5 days before the exam. Study guides are short and can be read in 10 to 15 minutes. 10 to 15 minutes in the morning and another 10 to 15 minutes in the afternoon is not a lot of work, but by the 10th reading, I bet you know most of the information. With respect to note-taking, the key is to only write down what is important. If you try to write everything down, then you'll not be paying enough attention to the lecture. Try to write down bullet points of key ideas and maybe a line or two about each. Try to focus on engaging with the professor. If you have a solid outline of all the key points, then you can come back later after class and flesh it out from the book or from repeated viewing of the lecture. If you're not doing it already, you may want to get a little more modern with your note-taking. For example, you can use an audio recorder to record the lecture. These days, AI can transcribe the recording for you and even reduce it down to notes. This would free you up to just focus on the lecture. You could also give one of the better chatbots your list of key terms and your study guide and your study notes and ask it to grill you flashcard style, instead of actually making the cards yourself, which takes a long time. AI is powerful and here to stay, so make the best use of it, but don't rely too much on it. There are already many studies showing that if you allow AI to do too much, then you fail to develop intellectually as a person. Next up, make a study group with people in the same class. A study group serves 2 main purposes. First, it makes you show up. If everyone in the group agrees, for example, to a schedule, then the social pressure of not wanting to blow off your friends will often make you do work that you otherwise would not have done. Second, usually at least one person in the group understands a given problem. That means you can usually get a quick answer from someone in the group. A final note is that there are 2 potential problems with study groups you want to avoid. Unserious people who talk about social things all through study time are a major drag and should be avoided. Second, too large a group is unwieldy and less than ideal. No more than 4 or 5 people is probably best. Next up, many schools have tutoring centers for many classes. Most students who are getting at least B's do not go. I would encourage you to go even if you technically don't need to. The tutors will often have different approaches or styles to solving the same problems, and seeing these will broaden your own understanding. The final approach is the most hardcore. I only recommend it if you want to master the material. This usually means the class is not only in your major, but it's basically what you want to do for a living. In this case, there is no such thing as overkill. You really want to understand the material backwards and forwards. The best way to learn a subject is to teach it to others. When you teach something to a person new to that subject, you are really forced to think about the subject matter. You come up with all kinds of ways of thinking about the problem. As you do this, your own understanding radically increases until you know it to an extent that you wouldn't have thought possible. Of course, you're a student, not a teacher, so you don't need to overdo this. Just find a friend or someone willing to learn the topic and practice teaching them the material. Taking turns in the study group works well. You just break up all the topics between the people in the study group, and then each person teaches the others their topics. Think up a teaching approach and make a few bullet points to guide your presentation, which should only be a few minutes for a particular topic. Then answer the questions of the other students. You'll be surprised at how quickly this deepens your understanding. That's it for the basics. This should be enough for 99% of classes. I will conclude with some advanced strategies for students who are in technical subjects such as the natural sciences, engineering, and math. If this isn't for you, then the rest is optional. Most classes, like linear algebra, first-year chemistry, physics, and so forth, have multiple textbook options. Your instructor chooses their favorite, but other teachers are using different books. I get copies of those other books and look at how they teach the material. Sometimes they cover a topic in a way that I find easier to understand than the book that I was assigned. Seeing the same thing presented in 2 or more different ways is quite helpful. For subjects in which the material hasn't changed in a very long time, something that is both interesting and sometimes useful is to get a very old textbook. Calculus, for example, hasn't changed in ages. How it is taught has, though. The books from the 1950s, for example, are hugely different from those today. You may respond well to one of those old teaching styles. Something even more interesting is that some really old textbooks take an approach that stresses self-learning rather than relying on lectures. These tend to be books from over 100 years ago. These very old books sometimes go into much more depth than modern books as well. I did this for linear algebra, for example, having found a really old textbook in the library. I learned a lot of cool stuff not covered in contemporary classes, but which turned out to be useful many times in many later subjects. An important bit of advice for really tough subjects is don't deceive yourself. Don't pretend you understand when you don't. You might be able to answer enough questions on the test to get a good grade, but deep down inside you know when you really don't understand something. For subjects like math and physics in particular, not understanding last week's material can catch up to you even if the test is over. The topic will come up again in a deeper manner in a future course, and then you'll be even more lost. In these cases, when you get the time, go back and do more work on the subject that you didn't quite get, even if you won't be tested on it again. You'll benefit in the future. Finally, if you're struggling, don't assume that you're not able to do the work. I've struggled with many topics and had to go over them repeatedly, again and again. So has most everyone. In fact, the easy, casual way some people have of explaining difficult ideas often stems just as much from hard work as it does from natural ability. Well, that's it. I hope you found this useful. If you like this content, please like and subscribe to support the channel. Also tell your friends. See you next time.